Ukrainian President Zelensky wanted some of the same for his own country and expressed disappointment both during the meeting and then, a little bit throughout, his disappointment that NATO didn't come up with a more concrete plan or steps for them to take before they can reach, ascend to the alliance. Now, a big part of this is there really shouldn't have been an expectation that Ukraine would join the alliance while the war was ongoing, simply because if Ukraine were to join the alliance, it would bring the entire NATO alliance into this war due to Article 5, which would literally put NATO and the U.S. and the West in direct conflict with Russia.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, there's a new weapon that the United States has provided to Ukraine, try to help the war effort. Talk a little bit about what it is and why it's so controversial.
So first, it's called cluster munitions, and the reason they're controversial is once they're deployed, unlike regular munition, it's made up of essentially tens of as many as 50 or even sometimes more submunitions, and so when it reaches its point of impact, essentially the outer shell dissipates and it sort of expands and sends these submunitions over a much wider target area. And so we're talking about multiple football fields. So part of the reason they're so controversial is not only is it just the sheer size that they sometimes can impact, which is a problem in a war like what's happening in Ukraine, given how close civilians are to the front lines.
Right.
But another aspect is there are some times where these submunitions don't actually explode, and then they essentially become landmines that can explode when stepped on and can pose risks to civilians years, if not decades, after they were expected to explode. Dating back to 2010, a number of countries, more than 100, came together to ban the creation, use, or transfer of these weapons. 75% of NATO is a part of this, and I said, more than 100.
But the United States is not.
Exactly, and neither is Russia or Ukraine. And so the U.S., we heard from U.S. officials that the other munitions that they'd been providing to Ukraine, they're getting low on, and it's not hard to imagine. The war's been going on for 18 months now almost, and Ukrainians are using thousands of these munitions a day. And so it's not hard to believe that the U.S. would be running low after all this. That being said, they have a separate stockpile of these cluster munitions, and they have hundreds of thousands of them, essentially ready to provide to Ukraine. And so the administration announced last week that they were giving it to them, and we heard today confirmation from the Pentagon that these munitions have already reached Ukraine today. So within about a week, we went from hearing that they were going to do this to that they've arrived. And it really demonstrates how the surplus that they have of these cluster munitions, which, as I said, a lot of NATO allies aren't following suit and providing to Ukraine.
And there are some members of Congress, including a sort of strange bedfellows coalition, who are pushing back against this.
That's correct. And so a big part of it is the risk that these pose to Ukrainian civilians, not just now, but for the years to come. And we heard from the administration, their argument is that Russia's already been using cluster munitions pretty much indiscriminately throughout the country. The U.S. has provided Ukraine with almost $100 million specifically designated to demining efforts, to tracking where these non-exploded submunitions land and how to defuse them safely. And so the U.S. remains committed to that. They also got assurances from the Ukrainian government that they wouldn't be used in high civilian areas, and that the Ukrainians would track where they are used to make these demining efforts easier in the future. And so another aspect is the rate with which these submunitions don't explode. According to U.S. officials, the cluster munitions that Russia is using have about 30 to 40% dud rate. So about 30 to 40%, about 1 in 3 of them, don't actually explode as intended. The U.S., however, is providing Ukraine with a much, not necessarily more sophisticated, but much more accurate cluster munitions. They have set a threshold of 2.35%. and so for a dud rate. So the U.S., when they are looking through their stockpiles, they're only going to be providing Ukraine with cluster munitions that have a dud rate less than that. So we're talking 2% as opposed to about 33% or 1 in 3 from the Russian side. So it really goes to show that while both the U.S. is providing Ukraine to use this weapon and Russia is using it, it's not exactly the same.
Mm-hmm. So Ukraine is getting its cluster munitions, but the Ukrainian government isn't getting everything it wants. What's a big thing that they're still seeking and not getting?
NATO membership. Mm-hmm. And so we saw this week President Biden and the NATO alliance get together for this highly anticipated summit in Lithuania. Going into the summit, we knew that both Finland and Sweden had applied for NATO membership following the outbreak of the war, looking to the West for more security. And so both have now sort of crossed the hurdles, but Ukrainian President Zelensky wanted some of the same for his own country and expressed disappointment both during the meeting and then a little bit throughout. His disappointment that NATO didn't come up with a more concrete plan or steps for them to take before they can reach, ascend to the alliance. Now, a big part of this is there really shouldn't have been an expectation that Ukraine would join the alliance while the war was ongoing, simply because if Ukraine were to join the alliance, it would bring the entire NATO alliance into this war due to Article 5, which would literally put NATO and the U.S. and the West in direct conflict with Russia, which is what the U.S. and NATO has actively tried to prevent.
So closer to home, Senator Tommy Tuberville's sort of standoff with the Pentagon over abortion travel reimbursements is really coming to a head now, with both the NDAA being debated and also some really important confirmations looming ahead. Talk a little bit about the status of that.
So as of right now, Senator Tuberville is holding up about 260 current DoD promotions or nominations. As you mentioned, he's doing this because it's his opinion that DoD was wrong in its policy that it came out with earlier this year to reimburse service members or their dependents who have to travel out of state for reproductive health care. Abortions, but also part of it is there are there are a number of different processes that are included in this. It's not just abortions, even though that's what his focus is on, right. Because of laws that say DoD cannot pay for abortions. Right. Now, obviously, this is a little bit of a gray area because they're not paying for the procedures. They're reimbursing for the travel expenses associated with not being able to get this treatment in their home state. That being said, a lot of this came to a head, as you mentioned, in part because of upcoming vacancies. We saw this week the head of the Marines leave his post due to his term expiring.
Right.
President Biden had nominated his the assistant commandant, his number 2, to fill his position, but because he's not yet been confirmed, he's now tasked with maintaining his role as the assistant while also fulfilling the role as the acting commandant. So he's now doing both, and it's not just him. Within the next couple months, we will see 4 additional seats on the Joint Staff come up for confirmation.
Including the chairman.
And the chairman, we heard, his name is General Charles Brown. He appeared before the Senate Armed Services Committee this week, and he talked about some of the significance that this hold is having, including on not just the leaders among the Joint Staff, but the families that are connected to the service members who may not be able to move across the country because this hold is ongoing. And he talked a lot about some of the impacts it has on families, considering it's the summertime. It's easier for families to move, to enroll in schools right now, right. And really talked about some of the impacts it could have in terms of retention for service members. Now, we don't know exactly how this will play out moving forward, but Senator Tuberville and Secretary Austin spoke today briefly, and they committed to speaking again next week. So it's really unclear exactly how this will play out, and neither side seems very willing to budge. However, both at least are willing to debate.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.